First of all, load up your file into Rhino, and we're going to export it. So if you watch the show or the tutorial, it was a little bit older version, but a lot of 3D Max, it still functions. So the basic functionality, the same ideas, the material editor, all of that stuff, the rendering, it's all pretty much the same. Another way I'm going to show you with this one here is to export as a 3DS rather than an OBJ, because that way we can, the 3DS file format is the 3D Studio Max file format, and it brings it in as objects and everything, but it changes all of this stuff to mesh, so that same way is going to happen. So what we're going to do is load up your file, and we'll select everything. So this is what we're going to export. File, export selected. And down here in the file selector, we can scroll over to, so here's the OBJ which he was using, but if you just use 3D Studio, that works just as well. And I'm just going to name this test 2. Okay, and then it gives you this selection as to more polygons or less polygons. So this is one of these things where it's critical, where he dumped a whole lot of polygons and he maxed it out. You have to really think about how far away you're going to be, and this really thinks about how many curved surfaces your project has, how far away that you will be in terms of the camera. So if you're going to be close up to something that's very curvilinear and you use a low polygon count, you're going to get these faceted or these segmented edges. So again, it's a little bit of thinking forward that that if you're not going to be that close, then you could probably go with a little bit lower polygon count. So what I'm going to do, and you can preview the kind of polygon count that you're going to get by clicking on there. You can start to see that the surfaces in here, the wood surfaces in here, are still meshed pretty good, and the surface, the terrain is not too bad. So I would probably stick with something like this. The thing that you have to trade off, the more polygons you have in the scene, the slower your scene's going to render. So you have to be really careful that you modify that, because you don't really want to get into a situation where something is taking an hour to render, because now you're starting to lose efficiency. You can't use your machine while it's doing that. So ideally, I like to try to make things so that it doesn't take more than like 10 or 15 minutes to render any particular scene at any time, because you're going to plan on taking it into Photoshop and fixing it that way. Now, the only thing that I would say that a lot of times for exteriors, you can probably get away with rendering times in less than 5 minutes. So. But it's when you get into the interiors where you have a lot of bounced light and lots of different lights, that's where you're going to really take a hit on the rendering times. So just keep in mind that what we're trying to find is this balance between definition and quality and speed. And you can make up for a lot of things in Photoshop. So that's a long-winded way of saying just be thoughtful of the kind of polygons you use and don't use too many. So we'll export that. And we'll open 3D Max. So that's where we're heading. Okay, so the first thing we'll do is we have this list. We go up here to in 3D Max, import. Come on. So this comes into a this is an important kind of piece when you start to think about, okay, I'm going to make some modifications, or you see some modifications you have to make, and you want to bring those in. When you're creating a whole new scene, or you're wanting to add elements, so a lot of times you might bring in the terrain, you save the terrain as a separate object, and you save the building as a separate, you can save them as separate objects. That's when you'd want to use the merge. Or you can completely replace everything in the scene. So when you're creating something new, it's probably okay to say completely replace, but just that's what merge objects mean, is that it's just going to add into it. Okay, so we have our object here. Because of my screen recording, my computer is going to be terribly slow. Alright, so first thing we want to do is kind of look up here, and we want to get the select objects, and we can kind of test and see how our objects are built. So we know we've got that surface, we have this surface. So if you've saved these things as poly surfaces or solids, your project is going to be organized really well. Okay, and so each one of these is coming out as a separate object, which is nice. And so that's going to make it, nice and easy to apply materials to. So when we get over here, we want to set up kind of a standard scene that we're looking at. So if we come over to this tab, we have a series of tabs: Create, Modify, Hierarchy, Motion, Display, or this is Systems, I believe, or Display, and then Utilities. So the main ones that we'll be using are in these Modify and Create tabs. So right now, what we want to do is we want to add a couple of things. Since this is an exterior rendering, we want to add a sun, and we also want to add a skylight. So when we're doing an exterior, so on a cloudy day, like we have today, you can see that the shadows are very diffuse, so the light is coming from multiple directions from this kind of hemisphere, which is the sky. And what we want to do is we want to recreate that so that we get these kind of diffuse shadows and the diffuse shading on the surfaces. And then we also want to have a sun, which is a parallel type of light, to illuminate and create kind of the hard shadows. So we want to create both the sun and, for some reason your guys, this gets kicked over. Alright, I just want to get this over here so you can see that side, what I'm talking about. Okay, so what I was saying is that the different types of lights that we have available. So if we go over here to Create, and we click on the third one, which are lights, and we can see that we have standard lights, and then if we drop on this drop-down box, we also have photometric lights. So the photometric lights, what those mean, they're actually tied to real-world calculations of lights. So if we were doing an interior and you really wanted to test and see what kind of lights what lighting would really be like in a space, you would want to use the photometric lights. But for general exterior stuff, a standard set of lights would work just fine. And so we're going to add two different types of light. So we have a skylight, which will give us that diffuse effect. So we're just going to click on that, and it's going to ask us to place it in the light. And the great thing about that is that it doesn't really matter where it goes, because it's a global thing. Organization here. Okay. Alright, so once you have that placed, you can click over here, and just what I like to do is click on select and then click off into the space where nothing's selected to make sure that there's nothing selected. So we can take a look at what that will do by just coming up here and clicking rendering. Like I said, mine's going to be super slow because of the screen recording. So you can already start to see that along this edge here, we start to see that diffuse kind of shadowing starting to take place, and up along in these corners we start to see these diffuse shadows. So I'm not going to, I'm going to let it finish just this little piece up here so you can see what that's like. Okay? Then we'll cancel this. All right. Okay, so the next thing we want to add is a sunlight, and there's a couple of different ways that we can add that. Let's see here. So if we go over to Systems, which is this last little gears on the far right, it'll have this piece here for sunlight. So sunlight's really nice. So again, it's we can just place it somewhere in the scene, and because it's generally a global sort of light, and it's going to create parallels versus a spotlight, which is going to have a diffused kind of ring that gradually gets bigger. This is going to create parallel lines of light. So we can just put that in here, and then if you want to get into it, you could actually select a location, give it a specific latitude and longitude of the location that you're in, so you can get more accurate shadows of what it would be like in the summer versus the winter, and so you can start to develop those type of things. So now that we've got that selected, I'm just going to make sure that I'm unselecting that, and then we can do a render. Oh, one other thing we want to make sure is go to render setup before we get too far into this, and just make sure that mental ray is selected down here. So if you go to go to renderer. Yeah, so on the Common tab, and then go down to the very bottom, just drag that tab, you get this little hand, and just make sure that that is NVIDIA Mental Ray. Okay. So now let's take a look at where we're at with the rendering, now that we've added the sun. Now we're starting to see a little bit sharper, more defined lines there. It's a little over bright, so we'll probably have to tweak that a little bit. But for now, it's pretty good. One of the things I like to do is before I apply materials, try to get the lighting set up the way you want it, so that it's working, because the materials can sometimes mess up what you're trying to get at, because you start to have some difficulty with that. So what you want to do is get the lighting all set up the way you want it, and then go through and adjust the materials. So if we go back, anytime you want to modify something, so we want to modify this skylight, for instance, or this sun system. Let's say we go and select it, and then we go into this Modify tab, and then you can select all of these different settings. You can turn it on, turn it off, the intensity and the color attenuation. So some of these things, the multiplier for intensity is how we turn these things higher or lower. You can also have it, attenuation means the fall off. So, you know, how far away it's going to decrease its intensity, you know, from a start or a given start or end point. Got directional parameters. I'm not going to go through all of these, because you can go through and test and show these different So what I'm going to do is just move this around a little bit. So what I did is I pressed W, which brings up the gizmo. Okay. Alright, so the next thing we want to do is we want to get in and talk about materials. So let's get over here so we can select our materials pretty easily. This is difficult with slow computer. Okay. Alright. So what I'm going to do, now that I'm getting ready to apply my materials, I'm going to rename my objects. So if I select it by select this, and then I select this object, I can rename it. So I'm going to click over here, call this one wood 1, select this one, and this one, the carcass. Okay, so then the next thing we want to do is, now that those are easily selectable, and we can also, when you have a big amount of items, you can click over here and select from the list. So now that we have this list, we can select from there. Now we have some descriptive terms about what those objects are. We don't have to guess what object 03 is. Okay, so the next piece we want to do is work on the material editor, which is up here next to the rendering. So if you open up yours, you're going to have a larger, this slate material editor. If you go to modes and select compact material editor, I think this one's a little bit easier to deal with. So let's just select one of these default materials, and we can start to modify it. So the way this thing works is we select a material, and we can click and drag a material onto one of these objects, so to apply it. So let's say I want to select this thing. Well, let's do a different one. Let's do, come on, select. There we go. You can click and drag over here, and it'll tell you what you're going to apply this to. And it applies it right to there. So let's say for now I'm going to apply it to all of these. And I'm going to apply it to this. So just have it all. Okay, so we already know that the type of material it is this architectural design, which is going to be good for us. And we can come down here and look at these different templates that we can start from. So we have glass, thin geometry, I think is something, so you don't ever really have to create a glass material because it's here. You've got chrome, you've got all of the basics, but you're going to want to tweak, and this is where you're going to spend a whole lot of time kind of tweaking little parameters in here and learning how to do these, because they're a good starting point, but they're almost never what you really want at the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I'm going to make a matte finish. This is what I want first of all. I don't want anything glossy. And I'm going to come over here and we'll leave the color the way it is. So we have a set of diffuse. Okay, so the diffusion is going to be described by the color. So we can select a color by clicking on that, but we can also apply map. So this is where if you wanted something to look like wood, you could select this box right over here and load up a bitmap or an image of a piece of wood or Corten steel or whatever, and we can put that in there. The diffusion level is basically, it's usually set to 1. You can lower it if it's for different material properties. The roughness is basically how it's going to scatter the light. So the the rougher it is, the more it's going to scatter the light. And you have to be careful with both the roughness and glossiness, because those are memory intensive. They can, increase your rendering times. So reflectivity down here, just think about this as kind of 0 to 1. So if you put 1 in here, you're going to be pretty reflective. It's going to be almost mirror-like, and so you can adjust those things. So because we don't, this is a total diffusion, a matte surface, we don't have any reflection, and we have very little glossiness. And we can start to adjust some different things, but I want to start to pop down here a little bit. So here's some self-illumination. So if you had like a ceiling panel that you wanted to act as a light, you could turn that on to have that. You start to pop in there. But the one I want to pop in is this special effects called Ambient Occlusion. This is, what it's going to do is take a look at all of the the geometry around it. And so, like, if we can look up into the corners up here, and we can see that the corners actually get a little darker as the two get together. So what this ambient occlusion does is just kind of gives a little bit of contrast to those corners. So I would turn that on. And then let's just take a little quick rendering. Not quick in my terms, because my machine is not quick. Alright, so you guys can start to see where we're getting there. So sometimes these kind of clay renders or ambient occlusion renders just by themselves can actually be pretty nice as a presentation materials. So just keep that in mind, that you can sometimes just not even have to go to that level, and you can take these into Photoshop and just start to add textures right in Photoshop rather than even messing around with materials. That's why if you get the lighting right first, you can save some time if you're really good at Photoshop. Okay. So that gives us a little bit of an idea. Okay, so let's go back to our material editor. And so let's create a new material right next to it. And we're going to base it on architectural and design again. And we're going to base it on the matte finish again, because this will be the outside of our carcass, the Corten steel. So what I'm going to do now that we have it, I'm going to click over here because I want to add that bitmap. So when we click on that, we bring up a series of maps, and we have a lot of different choices of what kind of maps. So the first one is bitmap because that's the most kind of standard, but there's all kinds of other things here that you can do. The other one that I would say that you would use a lot is fall off. I use that quite a bit, because the fall off you can get some of the reflections to be more realistic, because you notice how things that as you start to turn them glossiness become, as the incident angle that you're starting to, as the surface starts to move, it becomes more glossy as you become a little bit tangential to it, and less so when it's right in front of you. So you can start to set up those type of fall offs. That's another one. The other one you might use some are the noise. I think that's kind of the main pieces. So let's just go and put in the bitmap for now. You guys can go, you have to experiment and just see what you come up with. There's lots of different options. Okay, so I have downloaded some Corten Steel. I'm using the stuff that I used for my collage for the Photoshop lesson. Okay, so now I have it. Now I'm just going to drag it at this point and put it onto the carcass. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And then the other thing I want to do is I want to see what this looks like. So over on here we have some control panels. So we're seeing the end result, but we can also, we're in this map. So when we opened up that map, we've brought a whole nother palette of all the things we can do with just that map. And so what we can select is, if it will let me, there we go. We can choose whether we're in this map or not. We can go back there. The other way we can do it, if we're in this map, is that we can go to parent, which is right next to it. That'll drop us back up to the main grouping of controls. So the other thing we want to see is we might want to see what it looks like in the viewport over here. So we can click on Show Shaded in Viewport. So now we can start to see a little bit about how this thing is looking in terms of how it's being distributed on the surface. Right now it seems a little bit big. Doesn't feel quite right. So we want to start to look at tiling this this image. So basically saying how often does it repeat. So we're in a sense kind of scaling this image, and there's a couple of ways that you can do that. One was, if you guys watched the show, the tutorial, then they're going to, he showed you how to create the UV map. We're going to do that in a minute. But we can also go into mapping. If the UV maps are working okay, you can go right into here and start to size and select it here. So let's say we go 4 by 4. Okay, so that's getting it too big, so we want it to go less. So let's say we went 0.5. So now it's starting to look much better already. We could probably drop it down even more. Now yours are going to be different depending on the on what you have, the size of the image that you have, and the scale, what that looks like. All of those things are going to affect that. Let's see. We can also move this around a little bit. So I'm just kind of moving that seam a little bit. It's crawling over to this edge. I'm going to say that's okay for now. So I'm going to go back to my parent. And then I'm going to scroll down, make sure that that's not special effects. So depending on a lot of these things you have to test a little bit and just see if that's what you really want. You can have it when it starts to create the colors. The colors can come from the ambient light, and you can also do it from the materials, so we can start to get into reflections if you have different color materials. The other thing I would suggest when we think about ambient occlusion, and we also think about shadows in general, shadows are almost never black. Okay, so they're usually the what's the word I'm looking for? The complement of the color of the light. Okay, so oftentimes in the daylight, you know, the shadows will be more purple and kind of bluish, cooler tones rather than actually just solid black. So, and one way of adjusting for that is thinking about adding those kind of colors as tweaks. Alright, so we've got that set. Let's just take a little test render now. Now, one of the things that you can do, so as you move into the UV mapping, you can create actual maps that you can start to unwrap these objects and take them into Photoshop and actually create full paintings. So if you look into some of the tutorials, like on characters, when they creating faces and maps for faces, it actually will create basically a rectangular file. And so if you really wanted to get in here, you could start to create a Photoshop image that would wrap around there and give you all of your cut lines and all of the tiles and things like that. So this will do a lot of things that we're not going to cover, but there is plenty of tutorials out there if you really want to get into it, how you can start to do it. So we can start to see the rough and general idea of how we're putting this together. Okay, so one last thing before we just spend the rest of the day working on this is the UV map. And where this comes in particularly is in this scenario where we have these organic shapes that are not so easy to describe how you would map those. And so the first thing, so we could consider this as a box, because it's a rectangular shape, so that one makes it pretty easy. But with this one, how would you describe this shape? If you were going to say, how would I project an image onto this? Let's say I had a video projector. How would you try to describe what kind of strategy to project a texture onto this kind of shape. Thinking about the basic shapes like a sphere or a box or a cylinder or something of that nature. Which shape would you guys think would be the right one? You want to speak up? No idea? How about a cylinder? In a way, this is cylindrical, it's planar, somewhat planar around this edge. If we did a sphere, it's going to get distortions up at the top because the sphere is going to distort and squeeze the map to the points at the top, the polar points at the top and the bottom of the sphere. So as we went up this geometry, it would start to squeeze in and look weird. If we did a box, we would have some point here on this curve where it starts to transition to the other side where we would get this distinct line and the texture would all of a sudden look kind of strange. So a cylinder kind of wraps around. There would still be a little bit of distortion, but it won't be as bad. The other option you could do is thinking about a shrink, what they call a shrink wrap, which is basically like sucking the image into, or the projection onto the surface. So let's select this and let's go to our modifier list. So we've got that selected up here at this tab. Let's drop down this list. So here's all the things we can do to this thing. We can bend it, we can edit it, we can do all kinds of different pieces. But what we want to do is just go down here to the bottom and we want to select UVW map. So once we have that, now we can see, okay, here is, it's defaulting to planar, which we've already talked that we don't want. So we're going to select cylindrical. Then it's going to ask, do we want to cap? But we don't have any surfaces on the top or the bottom that we care about, so we don't need to cap it. And then you'll notice that we have length, width, height, how many tiles it's going to have. And then we have this real world map size. So if you want to start to edit these things, you have to uncheck that. And then we can start to put into the tiling here. So let's say, right now, let's just call it good for the moment. Let's go and apply the material to it. Make a wood material. So I'm going to select another one. I'm going to select a template. Now we could go into one of these varnished woods or something like that. That might be a good place to start. But I'm just going to go to a matte finish because I want to kind of create my own. So I'm going to go over here to diffuse color and I'm going to select bitmap. And then I'm going to come over and select a wood texture that I want. As my computer dies. That's another important kind of point. That texture was quite large, and so again, if you're going to do a lot of close-ups, then you need higher quality textures, you know, bigger textures if you're doing close-ups. But if you're doing stuff that's far away, you don't have to have textures that are that. that huge. So you know, keep that in mind. And the larger the textures, the more RAM that it takes. Okay, so we've got that set. Let's go back to our parent. And let's drag and drop this guy. We'll do it on this one too. Okay, so looking at it, we can do some modifications to this in the UV map. So let's say that we want to start to tile this a little bit more. Zoom in here so we can see what we're getting. Oops. Okay, so that's looking a little strange. So this is where you just go back and forth and kind of see what starts to ultimately work. Okay, that's probably good enough for the moment. So now we can see how the difference, because we didn't UV map the other wood piece, so we can see that the scale is different. But you can go in and do that one here in just a second. Oh, forgot to do one thing. I'm going to make sure that Ambient Occlusion is turned on. Okay. Okay, so once we have this rendered, a lot of times if the lighting is correct and you have just what you need, this will get you pretty much where you want to go. And a lot of times, you know, leaving the background just black or changing it to some crazy color like magenta or green can be helpful, because when you take it into Photoshop, then you can select that and create a selection and then replace it with your own background. You can just get rid of it. I'm going to show you how you can also export different layers out. So we can export just the color maps, or we can export just the shadows, or we can export what we call a depth map, so that you can use that depth map in like a lens blur if you want to blur things in the background and do some fog and some other things like that. So in the next session we'll get into that a little bit, but you can start to see that, you know, without too much work and on a super chunky, slow computer today, we're able to get something that's pretty good. I think in terms of this, I would start to think about things I would do in Photoshop. Like right now it's super saturated, so I would start to, you know, tone down the saturation of the reds and the Corten steel to make it look a little bit more real. I would modify, I think, the lights in terms of the sunlight and the sunlight color, changing the color of that to something a little warmer, and also start to think about how you would what kind of textures. So you can take a satellite texture, for instance, or some sort of grass, and give this terrain a base, kind of, or even a noise or something like that, that you would give this terrain a base kind of feel that would reflect up on this underside. So right now we're getting some weird underside reflections because it's not of the same value. So it's really white, so it's projecting, it's bouncing white light onto the underside of this, which isn't going to be really the case. So you would, I would start to turn this, you know, kind of a taupey color, or some sort of olive drab color to start to develop that. But think about the landscape. You want to be really careful about keeping those things saturated. So you wouldn't run, if this is grass, you wouldn't really want to turn it green, because it would start to reflect this really heavy green. So keep the saturation on these pieces really low that you're going to take into Photoshop and replace with textures. Just try to get the general gist of what you're going for. Okay, so Eric and Byron are going to be going around and answering questions and helping out, but just go through. Mostly you learn by experimenting. Okay, so save it once you get it to a place like now that you're feeling good about, and then just start clicking on things and testing different options about fall-offs, putting different maps, putting bump maps. We haven't talked about that, but we will. We'll start to get into bump maps and displacement maps and these type of things that will make your project look even better. Okay?